Ryan, good afternoon.
How are you doing today, sir?
I'm well. I'm back in Santa Fe. Just drove across the country with my daughter, and I like long drives more and more. So it was a great time for reflection and great time, to spend with her, and
Yeah.
it's beautiful to be back.
See all of America or most of it, good chunk.
Well, one very narrow stretch of it that is sometimes called I-40, but
Ah,
yes, I saw a cross section, if you will,
part of the story of America.
part of the
It's
story.
interesting.
Indeed.
It's interesting how it plays out geographically, the
Yeah,
story.
yeah, for sure.
But yeah, that's
How are you?
cool. Welcome back. I'm doing good. I'm making progress here, on a number of fronts and holding the tide back in others. So that's good.
Yeah, yeah,
you know.
yeah, yeah, good enough. Cool. So, you had something on your mind today.
Yeah, I have been, once we if for those longtime, viewers, you'll notice that there has been a sort of a randomness and yet a directionality to a lot of the conversations that we've had. And so various of the themes, like the song says, the themes all return to you. And we've had a bunch of themes kind of weave together. And once something like that happens, you find that it almost has a gravity of sorts, and it sort of starts to pull in other things. It's probably the phenomenon like when you buy a yellow car, you notice all the yellow cars, something like that.
Well, but chapters also have a gravity for certain kinds of influences, it seems. So, like,
Certain
I'm
topical,
thinking of
yeah.
when I started showing up at your house, there were a bunch of people, young men mostly around my age, also showing up at your house around the same time. And that chapter had a gravity of a sort. So, yeah, I guess I relate to that idea consistently.
And maybe the listening that's there sort of pulls out the curriculum that hits that listening. And so that might be what happened here, even though we have a whole different kind of listening. It's sort of a broader. But we've touched on a lot of themes in this piece that sort of happened on to me uh, a couple weeks, maybe less in, just plugs into a number of the conversations that we've had. And it starts out, as people might not have realized, like many of our conversations have sourced out of, the beautiful little town of Freiburg in Moravia. Now, where you might ask is Moravia? Look on a map, you won't find it.
I'm guessing
And
near
that
Bavaria.
you'd think it's actually now in what we call the Czech Republic. And we're focusing today on the son of a Moravian wool merchant. And but what's interesting is that this particular town wherein dwelt this wool merchant named Jacob and his family, they didn't stay in Freiburg, but Freiburg itself has played a setting to a number of the people that we've talked about already. And I wanted to read them because I had my friend Al dig them all up in line. The first one was, of course, Martin Heidegger, who we've spoken about Heidegger a bunch. Heidegger is the sort of the not the original source, but the more common source of the H word hermeneutics, where hermeneutics kind of met phenomenology. Also, phenomenology's founder, Edmund Husserl, who was Heidegger's teacher, also taught in Freiburg, who we've spoken about Husserl.
Heidegger's teacher or his student? I thought he was his student, Husserl.
Husserl was the teacher of Heidegger.
Okay.
And then we get to uh, a guy named, well, we've mentioned before a little bit, and we shall speak more about Hannah Arendt. Now, she was a student of Heidegger, and she wrote some interesting pieces that are one of which I'm reading now side by side with Kropotkin on revolution. And I'm thinking we might have some conversations on that some distant future time. And so I thought it'd be interesting kind of dig because this is coming out of phenomenology that's had hermeneutics and existentialism sort of all swirled in there by Heidegger. And so the other one who we've spoken about, who was also a fellow classmate of Hannah Arendt's, that is, student of Heidegger, was Hans Georg Gadamer. And he was the one who I really kind of dug into his idea of hermeneutics, and particularly this idea of ontological hermeneutics, which for people that didn't catch those prior episodes, it's this idea of how do we interpret things, where we have a whole picture of it and we're fed parts of it, and the parts inform this growing image of the whole that we store, and the growing image of the store contextualizes all the new parts. So there's this feedback loop that we call the hermeneutical circle. And that came out of these cats in Freiburg. I imagine Freiburg is a beautiful little town. I have no idea.
Does that represent one of uh, so there are places where psychology and philosophy meet, and really there are also places where they merge. Um,
Right, right.
and this seems to be one of them. Like how we make sense is a psychological question,
What I
but,
call a crossroads,
but the implication of making sense might be philosophical.
and vice versa.
Okay.
That I think a lot of Husserl's realizations about the dawning of consciousness and the nature of consciousness really do have psychological implications that were appreciated later on down the trail, maybe more.
Yeah. Is
I had
hermeneutic
some ahas around that for sure.
Yeah.
You know,
Is hermeneutics one of the first places where psychology and philosophy really collapse
um,
together?
no, I think you'll find it in Aristotle.
Oh, okay.
And maybe arguably in Plato also, in how one has relationship with one's emotions and passions,
Uh-huh.
and the higher impulses and the lower impulse and all that. Yeah,
Mhm.
and of course the church has some a version of its own type of understanding of psychology, which came along with Aquinas mixing Aristotle in there too, I think.
Okay.
Um, but so no, the other one that came out, who was another existentialist, was Karl Jaspers. And Karl Jaspers was also a teacher of Hannah Arendt's, and maybe even a bigger influence on her than Heidegger was. And who else? Max Weber, sociologist, political economist. Edith Stein, uh, influenced by Husserl, taught at Freiburg, and was later made a Catholic saint. So that's kind of curious. But the character that I'm thinking of is none of those. But he grew up, literally grew up, until his father's business took a shot and he had to move to Vienna. And that's the place that we usually associate this person with, this son of a Moravian wool merchant. We know him more popularly as, and here's where my visual aid comes in, Herr Doctor Sigmund Freud, who said, "Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar." This is my action figure complete with cigar.
That's awesome. He
So,
looks kinda like Sean Connery too.
yeah, he's like, I guess I don't have a place where he can stand here and, consult with us, but, my German accent isn't very good, so we probably shouldn't go in that direction.
I think the right shoulder is appropriate.
Yeah, there we go. I tape him up there. And, but the thing that occasioned my interest, reawakened my reinterest, because back in the day I studied Sigmund Freud. He was, of course, a teacher rather of Wilhelm Reich, who I later spent a lot of time with, a bunch of his psychoenergetic models, you might say. But Sigmund Freud is interesting because he gets a bad rap, and for probably a number of different reasons. And I think that maybe there's some things that we don't typically remember or understand about Freud that I wanted to talk about. But I learned those things from this book called, which is where what inspired this all, Insight and Responsibility, uh, by a gentleman named Erik Erikson. People familiar with psychology might recognize that name, but people who aren't familiar with psychology might be familiar with a concept that he originated that we know as identity crisis. And I thought, it's not entirely inappropriate for these times and for some of the conversations that we've had because these insights kind of play a role. The subtitle is Lectures on the Ethical Implications of Psychoanalytic Insight. And because our conversations turned in a direction that sort of elevated ethics, as many of these philosophers did, as in fact did Levinas, um, another student out of that same mix of Heidegger. And so, uh, although he might have come across him in Marburg or somewhere else, I'm not sure he's literally part of the Freiburg crowd, but he's part of the Freiburg headspace for sure. And but uh, so Freud. I mean, we could theorize why he gets the such a whack that he does, but
I I think because he was a pioneer, and that's what happens.
and because he was talking about sex, and which I think was charged up, and that's part of his point. Let's
Yeah,
put it
right.
yeah,
But not just that. I mean, the dreams having meaning and the unconscious playing a
exactly.
significant role in how we behave, and that our early relationships with parents are fraught, especially with mother, and like all of that stuff is charged.
Right.
And
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 people
and he wasn't right about everything per se, but if you're going to try to make a map of the psyche, and you're going to be the first guy to do it, you're going to make some mistakes, right?
and most importantly, he gave a framework for the people that came later to have a structure for understanding.
And we still use it.
Oh, and we do. And but one of the interesting things that people don't realize because of all the things that you just listed is they think that Freud is sort of like off in some, Fruit Loopy kind of a place. But the reality is that Freud started as a neurologist, right? He couldn't have been a psychoanalyst because he hadn't invented that yet. But he started out as a neurologist and a very strict materialist. And he was part of the school that thought that all of the problems of human consciousness could be explained through neurology. That is, through the biological machine needing a tweak like this or a tweak like that. And and I think that this was also sort of with the dawn of modern pharmacology. And so there was a popularity to want to say, well, you might not have enough of this, or you might have too much of this, and we'll just, tweak things and all those thoughts, just like the popular idea that all your dreams, well, that's just nonsense. It has no, just like Finnegan's Wake, it's all nonsense and there's no meaning in it and there's no way to move forward with that information. Well, Freud came to a different conclusion than that. But he didn't that wasn't the conclusion that he chose. That was not the direction that he headed in. He headed in quite the opposite direction, in fact. And he actually made a statement at some point rather that he wasn't going to attribute things to any other energies other than these materialist energies unless he was absolutely forced to. Which is like that's a pretty solid stand in one direction. And he was very much influenced by the scientific methodology and observation and collecting data and doing all that. But then, once he started to get onto this idea, uh, he started using hypnosis. He started doing interpretation of dreams. In fact, his first work was called On the Interpretation of Dreams. Uh, as he started to get this idea, but how radical it was, we can't conceive of that because we live in such a post-Freudian world. And the image that we have of him is sort of like, I trust we will soon find out in a similar way about Descartes. It's part of my prophecy. Um, that that we kind of only have a two-dimensional image of him, and he kind of becomes a bit of a punching bag for maybe some other things that happened in his wake more than he's responsible for.
Well, I mean, I think the the main reaction I'm aware of to Freud is, kind of like the canned. You tell somebody that they must be influenced by their own Oedipal complex, and they immediately go to how ridiculous that is. What a ridiculous idea that even is, that I would fall in love with my mother.
And
So
that a Greek myth would have anything to do with anything.
yeah, right. It's just stories.
Yeah.
So I really think he was over the target way more than not. And yeah, I think anybody that well, I shouldn't say that. But if you're curious about psychology, then discrediting Freud does you no good in your exploration, I think.
Right, right. It means there's some ground to be covered that's very basic, because you could think of this as the guy that discovered that maybe imperfect childhoods had something to do with the person that people became. And that becomes the crux that a lot of people that came after Freud in the psychoanalytic school sort of fleshed out and, checked out all the different side paths and have kind of made a fleshed out his framework for thought in an interesting way.
And in a very practical sense, that we construct defense mechanisms to navigate um, the impact of difficult childhood experiences, and that those defense mechanisms then govern our behavior in some way.
Yeah.
Um, Parallels the shamanic model and is mainstream coaching language today. Like business
Mhm.
coaching
Mhm.
has to address that stuff. So yeah, I took a course at a liberal arts college, the school that I went to, that um, that was kind of like physics for people that weren't sophisticated mathematically, and it wasn't physics; it was basic science
Uh,
for people that weren't mathematically oriented. And I believe the book we read was Seven Ideas That Shook the Universe.
uh,
And of the seven big ideas, Freud's mapping of the psyche was one of them.
well, and
That's a big deal.
there's this idea that genius is not hitting a target that other people can't hit. It's hitting a target other people can't even see. And that was definitely the case with Freud. And it seems like when these people come, because this also happened to Freud, is that he kind of had to. He's not the only one. We're going to talk about more thinkers and philosophers that had the same problem, where the thought that they have is so radical for the setting that they are in that it just even saying what they're saying is tipping over the apple cart. Kinda like Galileo was one of those guys, and they're saying, like, "We have got to lock this guy up just for the sanity of everybody because he's poisoned the well, with this thought somehow." And of course, the church was a great fan of that with the idea of blasphemy and wrong think was an official crime, and, but yeah, some of the thinkers, uh, including the person whose book I made reference to here, Insight and Responsibility, they once Freud said, stuff happens to us and it gets buried and it has this sometimes pernicious influence on us. And we don't typically see the mechanism that it works by, but we it can be unraveled. The mind can go in there and understand it. And in understanding it, some aspect of freedom is attained by that. And so they started trying to understand childhood better. which is like very logical. And because if this is where the problems are being set, this is the who's throwing the babies in the river. Let's go upstream and instead of keep fishing babies out of the river. If we can stop them getting launched in, the work will be a lot drier, at least. And so, so they started looking at early human development. And one of the things that caught my eye that, was sort of like our regular listeners know that I'm kind of a one string banjo about this idea is of virtues. And so Erickson here has laid out the virtues that he thinks are necessary in a healthful development. And he lays it out. Now he's kind of very specific about this. Says this is not a map. This is not an instruction manual of how to build children. This is not like these are generalities. He talks about Piaget, who was a famous experimental psychologist, and who's famous for his discovery or labeling of what we now call object permanence. That is, that a baby sees something and the baby acknowledges it exists, but then when you take it out of sight, as far as the baby's concerned, it's gone. Like it doesn't exist anymore. But at some point, the baby realizes that when you put the object behind your back, it still exists behind your back. And so they were trying to map out these different chapters idea. And
By the
he
way,
sort of
that's when you can really start messing with the baby. When they do think the object is behind your back, but it's not. And then
right.
new worlds are revealed.
Right. Because the thing was really in your ear. Look. Yeah. And monkeys. I've seen people, magicians playing games with orangutans and chimpanzees, and they get that same kind of wait a minute,
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing to watch. But so my point about Piaget was that Piaget really attacked the idea that there's discrete developmental stages. He said that you've got all these different things developing, dentition and structure and muscle mass, and he says, and all these things are all locked together in what he called a functional unity, which is an idea that also that made it later on into Wilhelm Reich talks about muscle groups having a functional unity. And which is basically things that we can make distinctions and see parts in it, but when they function, it's always these parts are always seem to be functioning as part of a bigger system, right?
I mean, that sounds like a pretty fractal, um, or an idea that can be applied fractally, right? I mean, that's the difference between coherence and fragmentation writ large.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And that we find it everywhere is part of that holographic nature. Yeah. But so he looks at these, even though he says we can't really make chapters and we can't really see stages. Here are the stages, basically, which is I think is valid. He says, so just reading this little sentence here, he says, I will therefore speak of hope, will, purpose, and competence as the rudiments of virtue developed in childhood. And we'll put these in the show notes with a little blurb about each one. And I'm going to go through each one and his definition, which is kind of interesting. So that's hope, will, purpose, and competence as the rudiments of virtue developed in childhood, of fidelity as the adolescent virtue, and of love, care, and wisdom as the central virtues of adulthood. Uh, and he goes on to mention that these seem like we break these things up as separate qualities, but they all depend on each other, which is why they're considered vital virtues by his way of thinking of things. And so, and so it's interesting, the first one of those is hope, and he talks about very early childhood experience, and he sees hope as like the first necessary thing. And he says that if you see a truly hopeless child, then you'll understand how fundamental is this quality of hope in the first foundational steps of the development of selfhood. And so he says, one of his first formulations, hope is the enduring belief in the attainability of fervent wishes in spite of the dark urges and rages which mark the beginning of existence. I'll read that again. Hope is the enduring belief in the attainability of fervent wishes in spite of the dark urges and rages which mark the beginning of existence, the ontogenetic basis of faith, nourished by the adult faith which pervades patterns of care. It's kind of interesting because now you're in that stage with your new one here, where you're actually you have a chance to see this the fruition of consciousness coming through a human being, if you will. Um,
It's been really interesting observing that, especially informed by 25 years of these conversations, and other life experiences that give me a perspective on it I didn't have 25 years ago, when my oldest was born, or 26 years ago. But it's interesting to stick hope on there, because I've been really cognizant of desire and will emerging, and kind of blown away at how baked in that stuff is. That without will, there's no drive for an infant to start figuring out how to turn themselves over. You can't teach them to do that, or
right,
maybe you can, but teaching them to do it is a completely different process from them grunting and pushing
right,
until they flip themselves over. Like, why would you do that? There's nothing
right.
there when you flip
Yep.
over. There's
Well, in Husserl, he points at that his idea of intentionality as even deeper than that. Just the consciousness moving out towards the creation and the world outside with an impulse to move into it.
and that's what
Uh,
you peg free will to.
and here's the next paragraph. Here, no doubt, is the genetic origin of the elusive question of free will, which man ever again attempts to master logically and theologically. The fact is, no person can live, no ego remain intact without hope and will, because will is, in fact, the next quality here. And so he defines will, therefore, is the unbroken determination to exercise free choice as well as self restraint in spite of the unavoidable experience of shame and doubt in infancy. He says the social problem of will is contained in the words goodwill. The goodwill of others obviously depends on the limitation of our own wills. And it's interesting. Here's another one I
I
thought that
I
linguistically was
I didn't
very
understand that. The
that
goodwill of others depends on our own limitations?
on the limitation of our own will. In other words, if we just try to get everything that we will, if we only are interested in what we want, then other people will not be happy with
Oh,
us.
okay, so it kind of like the birth of
Social
ethics.
contract, social contract, maybe that first seed of ethical
Yeah.
awareness. Yeah, and also the awareness that will is the basis for acceptance of law and necessity, and is rooted in the judiciousness of the parents guided by the spirit of law. This is an interesting word to jump in the conversation here at this point. And but then the other sense I liked is um, it will gradually grant. Is that what it was? Yes. a measure of self-control to the child who learns to control willfulness, to offer willingness, and to exchange goodwill, which I think is, that learning to work and play well with others. And in the end, the self image of the child will prove to have been split in the way in which man is apt to remain split for the rest of his life. Uh, which is an interesting. Chuang-Tzu talks about this. I think he says, when I do what I want, then other people are sad, and when I do what they want, then I'm sad. Well, what am I going to do here? Um, it's a pretty interesting little passage. I'll try to dig that one out too. Um, and so we've gone through will, and we now come to the third vital virtue, which is purpose. And he goes on and he talks about play and it, uh, it seems like a child spends on his play a sincere purposefulness, out of proportion to what he soon must learn, namely what things are really for, what their real purpose is. We underestimate the evolutionary necessity for representational play in an animal who has to learn to bind together an inner and an outer world. That's that split. Bind together the inner and the outer world, a remembered past and an anticipated future before he can learn to master the tools used in cooperation or the roles distributed in a community and the purpose pursued in a given technology. So, so he comes to define purpose then is the courage to envisage and pursue valued goals uninhibited by the defeat of infantile fantasies, by guilt, and by the foiling fear of punishment. So that's kind of like damn the torpedoes.
So there's a there's a consistency here in the descriptions that reminds me of Freud to some extent, which is interesting. Maybe we can pause on it for a moment, which is that hope has to manifest despite the horror of being alive, right? And purpose has to manifest despite the horror of being alive. And like, I just had this flash of how impossible of a task it really is to bind together an internal and external world when you got nothing to work with, or
And
almost
remember,
nothing to
remember
work with.
Reich's term Lebensangst,
Yeah.
l-
So
fear of living.
yeah. So does that resonate for you that shame and dark urges and devastation and existential um, loss that's what we're all kind of sitting in and manifesting despite like, or is that just a model? Like you think we're that is what the unconscious has is holding.
Well, I think that, yeah, that we are in a project of becoming complete, and that amounts to an awareness. I was thinking about this the other day, and that there would be a good graph in here, and that is as far as what you're pursuing in life, and because your pursuits, the things you truly value, you could graph them based on the things we all know. So, for example, if the virtues within yourself that you want to cultivate are around your physical beauty, we know what the graph like that looks like. It's pretty steep and it reaches a peak pretty early in life, and then it's just steadily downhill from that. So, that's informative of something. If we make some other choices that might be longer lasting. Uh, Say we're going to become a construction worker to make a good living. Well, we know that that'll start out and that'll last for a while. and then the physical vehicle will start to break down. Right, I've experienced this firsthand. I was in the line at the bank, and I saw a plastering truck guy next to me, and we had a little conversation about plastering, and I had said I had messed up my shoulder from plastering, and he says, "Yeah, I've got 2 stainless steel ones." But so that's, just a nice little vignette that shows you that, yeah, you're definitely gonna be functional. The value you've built up will last longer than, uh, your beauty will. Some of us don't have to worry about our beauty lasting all that long. But so the real question then becomes, how do this both of those paint life as you go up, you hit a peak, you hold the peak a while, and then it's all downhill from there. And there's this sort of an idea that after you no longer pretty, or you're no longer, capable physically of manifesting the value, doing the work, that pretty much all your significant value is going to be dropping off. And like Norm Macdonald was talking once about how when someone dies, they say, well, he lost his battle with cancer. And he says, so is that what it is? Everybody's life, they just lost the battle finally. No matter what, you always end up having lost the battle. Somehow, maybe intuitively, we have a little voice that goes, nah, it can't be right. Can't be right. So the riddle then becomes, what is the curve that just looks like this? And that as long as you live, it's like that famous violinist that they said he was in his 97 or something. He's still practicing every day. And they asked him about that. And he said, well, I'm making progress because he was on one of these. And they're reading him from one of these. Where, dude, you're 97. You're supposed to just be gumming your oatmeal down and drooling on yourself. But he's like, what will make that happen? Living this world model that says that this is the nature of human life and that's the inescapable nature of the story. But this model, I think this is the model that's important, not just to the old people who are up at this end. It's super important for these when people are down here. And that's one of the things that he talks about, which I thought was very interesting because, well, we'll get to it. Let's keep going with these nice vital virtues. So the next vital virtue he calls competence. And he says that maybe his friend White has a different model of things, but a sense of competence at any rate characterizes what eventually becomes workmanship. Ever since his expulsion from paradise, now this is a reference, of course, to the Bible and the curse that's put on Adam and Eve when they're driven from the Garden of Eden. Man shall live by the sweat of his brow. And so that expulsion from paradise, of course, man has been inclined to protest work as drudgery or as slavery, and to consider the most fortunate those who seemingly can choose to work or not work. Evolution has brought to pass that man, when he approaches the age of instruction in the basic elements of his culture's technology, is the most unspecialized of all animals. So, so his point is that there is a certain stage that the child needs to is ready for a variety of specializations and will learn most eagerly techniques in line with that ethos of production. Touching back to Bergson, that it is our natural capacity to manipulate matter and to make things, to be productive, as in the production of things. And so, competence then is the free exercise of it, dexterity and intelligence in the completion of tasks unimpaired by infantile inferiority. And so, I think this shows up a lot of ways. Probably starts out as clean up your room, right? And but also, I think that part of the dangers maybe if our life is too removed from actual things, is that our children can miss that development of competency within a defined area, whether it's being able to drive a nail, or I think for a lot of kids that learned kung fu with us, that was a scale of competencies. I think when I was in the Boy Scouts and there were ranks and there were requirements for those ranks, there were required competencies, and there was a ladder that you could follow to build more competency. And sort of wired into that was that you had to use some dexterity, you had to use some intelligence, you had to use some gumption to come to the completion of the task.
I think
And
there's also there's like a reality check that's built into learning about what competence means, and I think a lot of kids don't get this from their parents these days, where everything you drew is beautiful and gets hung on the fridge, has its merits, but let's keep it real too. At some point you got to say that doesn't look like an elephant, or there's a container where coddling um, is outside of which coddling starts to do a lot of damage. Um,
it prevents the building of competence.
it prevents the building of competence, and then there's a reckoning later.
Has
Um,
to be.
and I
No, and
think
I
that's really common.
I see parents today, and then I remember hearing one of the code talkers, I think it was, who was in his age, one of the Navajo code talkers, and he was talking about when they had to go to school, and that, it was like a number of days through the desert to get to the school, and they let the kids, like, go across the desert, knowing where to find water, like the whole deal, to end up a few days later at school. And it was like, oh, and bring your 6-year-old sister with you. And their lifestyle built that type of competence. And their understanding already at that age of animals and the way things worked was different because the lifestyle was different. And we move away from that at our own peril. And the peril of future generations. And there may be the real peril is that there may be a self-righting mechanism to this. And if we get too far from the base, we may get slapped back hard back into reality.
I mean,
Like,
it's another version of the good times make weak men make bad times make strong
right,
men. I mean, it's that.
right. Hitting the guardrail and it bumping you back onto the highway. Yeah. So the adolescent virtues, it's interesting because like he points out, when human sexuality matures in puberty, that doesn't mean they're ready to really be a mate or a parent. And that there's actually a real question where he gets into about how the adolescent attitudes or our culture's attitudes about adolescent sexuality and whether a freer attitude actually makes people freer. And I think when this was written, these were lectures that all happened, I think, around Freud's 100th birthday, what would have been his 100th birthday. And so it's a little bit different world than the one that we're living in. We've run this cultural experiment a few more cycles than when Erikson is talking about. Um, and remember, Erikson was the one that coined the term identity crisis. And I think this becomes even more significant later here. But so he defines fidelity as that adolescent virtue. And he calls it the ability to sustain loyalties freely pledged in spite of the inevitable contradictions of value systems. It is the cornerstone of identity and receives inspiration from confirming ideologies and affirming companions, which of course we see in adolescence. Um, But uh, he says, in youth, such truth verifies itself a number of ways: a high sense of duty, accuracy, veracity in the rendering of reality, the sentiment of truthfulness, as in sincerity and conviction, the quality of genuineness, as in authenticity, the trait of loyalty, of being true, quote unquote, fairness to the rules of the game, and finally, all that is implied in devotion, freely given but binding vow, with the fateful implication of a curse befalling traitors. When Hamlet, the emotional victim of his royal parents' faithlessness, poses the question to be or not to be, he demonstrates in word and deed that to him, to be is contingent on being loyal.
It sounds like this is where you get to establish having character and what it means to have character, or really, whereas I kind of read the building blocks of childhood that you went through as necessary for virtue. They do not comprise virtue, but fidelity starts to. Um, it needs boundaries, right? And
Virtue
I
needs
think
to live in the world.
in
Yeah.
adolescence, fidelity is often unbounded, and that causes some problems. But you have to experience that in order then to. It's kind of like going from dependence to independence to interdependence. You have to kind of let those boundaries flex so you can figure out what works and
Yeah.
what doesn't. And I,
Well,
you know,
and
I remember feeling a loyalty to my friends as a 14-year-old that I thought would that 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 I would always want to feel, and these surely would always be my friends. And I, I was somewhat surprised later to find out that that's not actually how it works. But feeling that so strongly, and I think a lot of kids do, and I think in hindsight, what we're doing is experimenting with what it means to have character, and it's interesting because back to Levinas, we do that through our relationships with others.
yeah,
We
yeah.
can't manifest fidelity by ourselves, right? Fidelity to what?
Well, and that's why what I think Erickson suggests here is that maybe we've lost some pieces that they're through rites of passage, through sort of collective awareness of this new chapter and this new person that inhabits that new chapter, and sort of verifying and stabilizing the collective vision of that individual's identity. And now that happens within peer groups. It doesn't happen within a lot more broader social structure, which I think becomes significant later as we roll this same story forward. Because there's an interesting thing that comes of this when we get to the end and the development of it. Um,
Worth a side note, maybe. I
mhm.
think it was in seventh or eighth grade. I was having a really hard time in school. I was really checked out, and I remember we had to write an essay for an exam in class on rites of passage, and I didn't know what rites of passage were at all. But I wrote an essay about the inter-country political um, need to allow trade through waterways, and that you had to give rites of passage for
You had a G in
merchants to
there.
be able to come through, depending on the political environment. And yeah, I got credit for creativity, but an F on the essay.
Well,
But I remember
uh,
now very well what rites of passage are.
right, right, and, it seems like, what was the other one? Domestic violins. They're just as good as the old ones,
Yeah.
they're like, um, yeah. Well, and it's interesting because, I think for me, again, martial arts and, becoming a black belt, it means different things within different traditions. I don't think it means the same thing when you're giving black belts to 7-year-old kids, because they're still 7-year-old kids. But in the tradition that I was given that, it was not a given that what was the given was that most people would never make it to black belt. Just like in Boy Scouts, most people are not going to become Eagle Scouts. Uh, there's a ladder, but it's not that everybody makes it to the top of the ladder. Um, but I think that again, that was building competence that gets recognized within a community, which holds a standard for competence. And and I think that that was also because I feel like one of the qualities that I walked away from that with was the ability to have fidelity to principles and as opposed to fidelity to peer groups. And and that's that inner world, outer world split right there. And honestly, if you don't manage those 2, if you just satisfy the outer world, your inner world will suffer. And the outer world's likely to not work out that well either, it turns out. Who knew? But but and I've just been realizing myself over some of these past things where I faulted and where through inaction and where I maybe took the easy path, where I actually should have been less tolerant. I should have actually schooled some people more. I should have held to certain principles, but I not out of peer group stuff, but more out of like compassion and wanting to get along. And probably some of that orphan stuff about wanting to be useful and wanting to be workable, and God knows you want everybody to like you all the damn time, right? So yeah, it's not like you don't stop, you know this conflict gets thoroughly settled, but it's interesting. And then that transition, the adolescence he describes later, or rather, he describes it in an earlier section where he's talking about, interestingly, the psychological issues of migrants. And he talks about the nature of uprootedness, and that uprootedness has certain psychological components that go along with it. And those components are in high amounts within adolescence in general. That the state of adolescence is a state of a type of unrootedness, and that these are actually mechanisms that help that rooting take place. And that there need to be some other structures, which interestingly, I think the thing that was like a little aha and a of course duh at once is the relationship of the chapters, which now we're going to get into to some degree when we come into the adult chapters. And so the first adult virtue is love, the greatest of human virtues, and in fact, the dominant virtue of the universe. So commonly assumed that it will
That
be
was
well to
that was going to be my topic for today.
Oh, well, there we go. The
Yeah,
dominance of the
and I think we should still do an episode on metaphysically what does that last thing you said mean, and
right,
not now
right.
because
No,
that takes some unpacking.
but I will read it again.
Yeah,
The greatest of human virtues, in fact, the dominant virtue of the universe, so commonly assumed that it will be well to consider once more its evolutionary rationale, and to state why love is here assigned to a particular stage and a particular crisis in the unfolding human life cycle. Does not love bind together every stage? There are, to be sure, many forms of love, from the infant's comfortable and anxious attachment to his mother to the adolescent's passionate and desperate infatuation. But love, in the evolutionary and generational sense, is, I believe, the transformation of the love received throughout the pre adolescent stage of life into the care given to others during adult life. And so love then is mutuality of devotion, forever subduing the antagonisms inherent in divided function. He's talking about here, particularly um, male female unions and their which was taken for granted in those days that there were different but complementary functions that mother and father served and that they were not interchangeable. I'm just reporting it. It's here in the book. It's on the paper. Okay. So enough said. The mutuality of devotion forever subduing the antagonisms inherent in divided function. It pervades the intimacy of individuals and is thus the basis of ethical concern. Love can also be joint selfishness in the service of some territoriality, be it bed or home, village or country. That such love, quote unquote, too, characterizes his affiliations and associations is at least one reason for man's clannish adherence to styles which he will defend as if his life depended on them, end quote. His ego's coherence, his certainty of orientation do depend on them. And it's for this reason that ego panic can make man, quote, go blind with a rage which induces him in the righteous defense of a shared identity to sink to levels of sadism for which there seems to be no parallel in the animal world. We've talked about this before too.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I guess he's saying a lot there, both about the capacity that humans have, and I guess that's maybe he would say that because bridging the inner world or integrating the inner world and the outer world is such a massive undertaking that and all of that, what we were talking about earlier, all of that darkness that we're keeping at bay in the process by somehow manifesting hope and purpose and exerting will.
And it's a messy business.
Yeah, that failing to do that, the darkness can't be kept at bay, right?
Right, right. And there is part of the argument for free will, right? Because only free will can play that game, honestly. Um,
I
and so
mean,
the next one is care. And care is sort of an expansion on that, interdependent with this idea of love. And he calls it the widening concern for what's been generated by love, necessity, or accident. The widening concern for what has been generated by love, necessity, or accident, it overcomes the ambivalence adhering to irreversible obligation, which is an interesting one. And, what does he mean by that? Overcoming the ambivalence adhering to irreversible obligation. Every parent knows that, whether they know that term or not, right? Because you're in it. There ain't no getting out of it. Not any real, you know, correct ways. And
huh.
but that care, whether it's been for what has been generated by love, necessity, or accident,
Uh-huh.
for what has come about, a widening concern for what's been generated that overcomes the fact that it's stuck on you and it's an obligation. You know, that's like my fruit trees, right? Every morning I got to be out there, and if I don't if I don't adhere to my obligation, uh, then they won't live. And without my care, there will be no fruitfulness. Right?
Yeah, I mean, it gets tricky. So my daughter Rebecca is also our producer, so I know that she's going to get to see this because she'll be editing it soon. But when you're not sure if your care is a net benefit or not, that gets tricky.
It is. It is.
Just
And,
saying.
and it's it's a serious question. It really is. Um, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because care extends in so many different ways. And this idea, the widening concern for what's been generated by love, necessity, or accident also means, care that manifests in one's work, care that manifests in the messages that we put out to the world, the things we leave behind us, um, as part as extensions of that. Um, so after care, which he goes on at some point here, I'll put all this so when you want to get your you want to get your own copy of this and hunt it down, and we'll have it in there because I think it isn't something that you find around, and so
I think I just want to say I think the premise is profound that the that as we gain greater insight into the psyche, we take on some responsibility also, or we'd best take on some responsibility. Um, like with great power comes great responsibility, or in this case,
mhm,
knowledge is power. Um,
mhm,
that's a profound statement to me, and I think we overlook that frequently as we're seeking knowledge. Um,
mhm.
and maybe after you talk about wisdom, it's worth talking a little bit about what why ethics is informed um, by knowledge in this way.
Yeah, yeah. Um, it's interesting because here, when we come to the last stage, uh, he points out, he says, we become aware of the fact that our civilization really does not harbor a concept of the whole life, as do the civilizations of the East. And he quotes, in office, a Confucian, in retirement, a Taoist. That is, Confucius philosophy is very interested in social interaction and appropriate relations and the law and order and the manifestation of humanity and justice within society. And the Taoist in retirement is about developing this final quality, wisdom. And it's associated with old age because it implies a certain distance. We think of the Taoist as the one who retreats into the mountains, Han Shan. Maybe we should do an episode someday on Han Shan, the cold mountain, who was a recluse. And the Taoist typically, Lao Tzu, the famous Taoist, he was riding off into the mountains, and the gatekeeper to the city said, "Wait, I can't let you leave until you write this down." And so that's probably why it's written like telegrams. It's like, I got to get out of here before the snow comes or whatever. but but that idea that one, and again, this is one of my banjos one string banjo songs is about the importance of nature, and this idea that there is something, this is a random association with Spinoza. Spinoza says that when we have intuitive knowledge, we see everything. He wrote in Latin, so we see everything sub specie eternitatis, which means under some form of eternity, which is one of the lessons of nature is the eternal cycles, the eternal turning of that. But so what he says here is that for each generation must find the wisdom of the ages in the form of its own wisdom. Strength in the old, therefore, takes the form of wisdom in all of its connotations, from ripened wits to accumulated knowledge and matured judgment. It is the essence of knowledge freed from temporal relativity. Wisdom, then, is detached concern with life itself in the face of death itself. And what's significant about this is that if you're living a life that's doing this, and the story that you live and the worldview that you live is that this part is the inevitable part, as opposed to this model where this part is a potential outcome. Your interaction with all the people that are in the chapters in in the cycles following you have just downloaded a sort of a pointless existence for their map of how life works. If our image of getting old is just losing capacity, losing the ability to experience life, what a bummer. It's like, well, who wants to plant their garden if that's all it's going to grow as black pumpkins or something, you know? But if the argument that he's making here is that this, what does he say? Individuality here finds its ultimate test, namely man's existence at the entrance to the valley which he must cross alone. So that if we've really developed, if we've really fruited, then our strength manifests as wisdom. Our strength manifests in that fulled out, fleshed out hermeneutical base that now is so rich, that is so dimensional, that is so digested that all the new pieces that come in are considered as if they have a shining light coming out of them because this piece now sits in a different setting that was built for it by ages of development of consciousness. So that's the holistic picture of the whole cycle of life. And obviously, materialism here is the booby prize, right? That's the point of this final chapter. That's the point of this.
It's interesting
Materialism can't be it.
from a Darwinian standpoint, and the theory of evolution was also one of the seven great ideas that shook the universe, and it did, right? Um,
Sure.
Fair enough. Um, the the manifestation of hope and will and competence and ultimately caring, love, wisdom, um, being an evolutionary mechanism that increases the chances of sexual reproduction. It is a kind of bizarre conclusion to arrive at. They're
Right.
like those don't seem to be like those are evolutionary accidents, and somehow trying to deal with the darkness of having to bridge the inner world and the outer, and reconcile them. That being an evolutionary like um,
Written into the script.
advantage. I mean, it is, I'm sure, because culture through that process, we have knowledge that we couldn't possibly manifest individually on our own, like a lizard has to a greater degree, right?
Right,
So
right.
that some of it I can see evolutionary benefit, but this can't just be about sexual selection, right?
No, it seems like, again, Bergson would roll his eyes or shake his head or one of these things. That's why I love Bergson so much because to him, it's obvious. Well, first of all, once you've said that love is the fundamental energy of the universe, your your materialist arguments are starting to get recontextualized. And uh an argument might be made that the part we're fixated at in the on the ladder is kind of our represents the stage of our development of our consciousness. and which is not about how smart we are. We can be very smart and miss entire boats, big boats, and um, and again, there is this difference between a sort of an abstracted intelligence or abstracted knowledge and a lived knowledge or a lived intelligence, this phronesis idea we've talked about. And but so the other, I think the thing that was most the biggest aha for me about this so far, and I haven't quite finished all his lectures, but maybe there's more, I'm sure there's more goodies to fish out of that, but was this idea of the again, we want to the cinematographical approach, using Bergson's term, says let's look at human development, and we'll look at these chapters, and then we'll understand each of these chapters that go through. Okay, fair enough, except that's not the way it happens. Nothing gets taken out of it. It's all mashed together. So to understand this individual's function in this chapter, you have to understand the impact of all the other chapters and their relevance to that chapter as manifested in the people all around them. Your picture of the world as a young man kind of depends on the download you get from old people and what they seem to convey about what life is about. And so you want to pass this ultimate test of individuality, as he calls it, not just for your own fulfillment, but because it's part of the fulfillment. Like that's happening through everybody's. And so it's a contribution, it's a manifestation of your love and care for all these other things that were created by accident. Let's put it that way. And so this is another wake up to find out that you are the eyes of the world. You're not just the eyes of the world, but you're also the thing that the eyes of the world is seeing itself through or at. You're manifesting the world that the world sees. It's like the inverse of being the eye. You're being the object also.
The projector and the projected. Yeah.
Exactly. And having relevance. That's why teaching is so important. Because teaching is an example of two chapters, like all the young men that you talked about, they were usually just a chapter behind me, or two, more or less, because there was a whole period there. When I started, they were very close to my chapter. And then as I got older, I still had more. So there maybe was some distance there. But it was that intergenerational uh, chapter relations there.
It's only now that I can understand how that kind of relationship is mutually fulfilling, and that teaching is fulfilling in ways that you can't quite imagine when you're a student.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why some of my teachers, they say, you should always start by saying thank you because you're very well served by it. No question about it. And yeah.
So
Well, we're
before
getting on
we
there. We probably should.
before we wrap,
Mhm.
I just wanted to ask if you had any comment on this subheader about the relationship between ethics and insight, because I think that's really profound.
Yeah, and um, what does he call it here? Yeah, yeah. And responsibility, which we've talked
Yeah,
about before.
that's what I'm
Yeah,
using ethics as a
for ethics, right?
yeah.
And well, and it's interesting because responsibility is the same term that Fagin used in a different kind of way than we usually use the word. And I think that in this sense, yeah, uh, um, the term insight is a really good charged up word. And you don't have to be a Latin scholar to understand what this word is about. Seeing in, right? And we typically think it's about seeing in things that are outside. But this is the seeing in that's going to illuminate responsibility, right? That's tied up with your what Heidegger called your Dasein. You're manifesting as a you here, there, now. And or as Ram Dass's book, Be Here Now. That's a manifestation. What he's really telling you is take responsibility, right? And so so yeah, there's a lot going on there. And again, this quest for insight and responsibility are related in that what you learn from insight defines and impacts what your responsibilities are. And you can't really they're two sides of the same thing. So you're not going to be fulfilling your responsibility without some insight. And it is your responsibility, therefore, to gain some insight. Those kind of interdependent.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting one. It reminds me of the Hippocratic Oath, and it reminds me of all kinds of developmental questions where we find ourselves in deeper water, characterized in some way by this relationship of greater insight and responsibility. Like what you were saying about care, um, is the outcome of insight. Um, so yeah, maybe there's just another episode to do there,
Mhm.
and we can leave it here for today, on the
Yeah.
rudiments of virtue. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting sort of a connecting piece that just kind of dropped in and dovetailed to so many things so nicely. And I got to use my Sigmund Freud action figure.
Yeah.
Our guest for today,
Uh-huh.
us and Sigmund,
Nice. Siggy.
my buddy Sig. Yeah, cool.
Thanks, Brian.
Well, we shall see you in the future. And for folks that made it this far, congratulations. And I always want to reiterate that we have show notes. That's kind of a regular thing. So often we sort of give you the foundation to pursue other threads. And we still don't get a lot of comments or responses. And so if you feel the impulse and you figure that fingers get itchy, just drop us a line.
Yeah, be great
Yeah,
to hear from folks. Alrighty.
cool. See you next time, folks.